Hello and welcome to Stratford Chefs School Open Kitchen at Home with Chef Eli, where today we're going to be looking as to how to make bacon at home. We'll begin looking at some theory behind how to produce bacon, specifically types, where it's from, and how to produce it. Here, looking at the animal, we'll see that traditional side bacon comes from the belly and back bacon comes from the loin. Here we see some associated different types of bacon and where they're from on the animal, and we'll get into some theory behind the brining practices. Curing your pork with salt and ideally nitrates is essential. The option you have is wet or dry. A dry cure has salt, sugar, nitrates, and seasoning agents combined and applied to the commodity in a dry form. Essentially, once they are applied, they're going to be drawing moisture out through the process of osmosis and essentially making a wet brine if this is captured, as we can see in the Ziploc bag scenario. Alternatively, we can make a wet brine right off the bat. This has us dissolving our commodities into a liquid, cooling that liquid, and then applying to the commodity for several days. Note that these recipes will have sugar or a more simple sugar of dextrose in them to aid in the fermentation process, as well as the addition of nitrates, which are a strong preservation agent which add umami flavor and lock in pink color. Likewise, this pink salt or prog powder is often hinted pink so that we don't mistakenly use it as salt in our kitchen. The length that our commodity is submerged in this wet brine is dependent on the size and bone-in nature of our commodity. Moving into our recipe proper, we're going to be looking as to how to make side bacon at home. To begin, we'll start with pork belly, salt, sugar, nitrates, black pepper, and chili flake. We are going to combine these dry ingredients and then apply them to the pork belly. We're going to have that away from oxygen in either a lidded or bagged environment for 7 to 10 days as it cures, flipping every day or so. Looking at this process as we do at Stratford Chefs School, we're going to be starting with our mixed combination of salt, sugar, nitrates, black pepper, and chili flakes. Notice that I have only a small amount that we're going to be adding to the pork in a bowl. I don't want to contaminate any excess nitrate powder. If we aren't using it, can be used in the future. So here we're going to be using gloved hands. We're going to be applying it liberally across the entire surface of the pork. We're actually going to be rubbing this in quite abrasively to actually have it adhere to and actually dig in a bit into the flesh. So once we've done the first side, the skin side, which has been removed, we're then going to be doing the flesh side where those spare ribs would have come off of, and we're just likewise going to be rubbing this in with our hands. We're going to be using this liberally. Anything that does not want to naturally coat into the pork with rubbing with our hands will fall off as excess, which we can apply either on this pork belly or the next. Once we have a nice even coating along all sides, we're going to be putting that into a container with the flesh side up. We're going to be continuing this process with the next pork belly. If you don't have full pork bellies, which you might not at home, cut your pork belly up in the size that you're going to be using on your smoker apparatus and interlayer them as shown here. We want to have flesh side on flesh side with any skin sides exposed to any air oxygen. Here we're going to be using a bin. At home you can just as easily use a Ziploc container to keep free of oxygen. Here, we're just going to be wrapping it with some saran wrap. What's going to happen is the moisture and salt is going to be drawn out of the pork, creating a brine effect in the bottom. We're going to be flipping this every 1 to 2 days. Here, we're going to see the pork belly after 2 days. We're going to be removing that top piece, removing that bottom piece, inverting that top piece into where the bottom piece was, again, keeping the skin side down into where that liquid brine is, and keeping the two bellies flesh to flesh. Put it back in the fridge for 1 to 2 days. Around the 4th to 5th day, we're going to be seeing that the pork belly is starting to firm up and get a bit more strong or denatured. Here, we're just going to see the same repeating process of flipping these pork bellies and returning back to the fridge. We're going to continue this process for 7 to 10 days until we have a nice firmed up pork belly so that it is firm to the touch. Once our pork belly has firmed up, we're going to be rinsing off any excess cure, moving it onto a trivet or cooling rack, and allowing it to dry off to develop a bit of a skin or pasille skin, which will allow it to have the smoke stick to it a bit easier. The easiest way to rinse off the pork belly is to have a large amount of water rather than putting it into a large sink. It's kind of hard to grab and manage, so by putting it into a large container, we can very easily rub off any excess. Any brine brine that's left over from the pork or water will be discarded. These are single-use items. Once we've rinsed off the pork bellies, we're going to be using a clean towel or paper towel, and we're going to be draining off any excess or pooling moisture. We're going to leave the pork belly on these racks, move them into the fridge, and allow them to develop a tacky skin so that the smoke can stick to them much better. To smoke the pork bellies, we are going to be using a smoker apparatus. Here we're using cherry wood, but any hard natural wood will work. We're going to be using a Bradley smoker here, which uses composite pucks. We add those into the smoker. It heats offset, adds into the chamber cooled, and can be used as either a hot or cold smoker. Here we see that we've turned it on with only the cold setting. We do have an option here to turn on a heating element as well, so we can turn on a pre-programmed timer and set it to whatever temperature that we want. To begin this bacon process, we're going to be starting with a cold smoke, so we're going to turn off the heat and only smoke in this offset element so it billows in a cooled state. If you do not have this type of smoker apparatus at home, you can jerry rig one up. You can buy both the smoker chips and these types of smoker holder apparatus at your Canadian Tire or local big box store. We're going to be putting the chips into this container. We're going to be putting the lid on. We'll move it to your grill and then turn on the heat. If we're trying to do a cold smoke, you're going to be wanting to do this with the grills off of it so that we don't conduct or radiate any heat as the smoke is starting to billow. As the smoker is heating up, we're just going to be moving or cutting our pork into the size or racks that we're going to be using. You also have the opportunity to slightly freeze the pork while we're starting to fill up the chambers with smoke for about 20 to 30 minutes. We don't essentially want to freeze the pork, but we do want to get it as cool as possible without freezing before we start this smoking process so that we can keep it in a cold environment and out of the danger zone. Also keeping in mind that a couple hours at room temperature with this pork isn't going to be harmful, as it has been heavily cured with nitrates as a preservative agent. So once we have billowed the smoke for about 20 minutes and chopped our pork, we're going to be moving it into the chambers and closing this up to trap in as much smoke as possible. We're going to allow this to smoke. We're going to see after about 5 to 10 minutes, we see a development of smoke around this. We don't need an excessive amount of smoke. We're simply going to be keeping this at this low cold setting for the first 2 hours of the smoking process. After approximately 2 hours, we can see that color has started to take on this. Even though the pork is essentially uncooked, we're still at about the 100-degree at most temperature. So at this point, what we're going to be doing is continuing the smoking process, but starting to apply heat. We're going to be increasing the temperature up to about 250 to 270 in the oven and continuing to smoke this for 2 hours until we have an internal temperature of the pork belly of approximately 155 to 160 degrees Fahrenheit. If after 2 hours of hot smoking you haven't achieved that temperature, you can remove it and continue the heating process in an oven until we reach that 150 to 160 degrees. Here we see the pork coming out after the 2 hours of hot smoking or 4 hours of combined smoking. It did reach the 160 degrees internal temperature, so at this point we can cool it off. It's ready for you to slice and cook at your leisure. To apply a double smoke, chill the belly down completely to fridge temperatures, then increase for 2 hours of hot smoke back up to 150 Fahrenheit a second time. Once cured and smoked, it will last fresh up to 3 weeks or frozen several months. Enjoy!